Hello everyone, my name is Trevor, I go by TheMrTrails, welcome to the channel. Come one, come all, it is time for the Dauntless Weapon tier list. This is going to be a tier list of every weapon from every behemoth, excluding repeaters. I figured that doing a tier list format would be more informative than just one of these are the best list, because this way you get to see how everything stacks up with one another. And as far as these ratings go, they are going to be within the weapon class, so a S tier War Pike is on the same level as an S tier Strikers. But if you enjoy, consider leaving a like on the video, and if you enjoyed Dauntless and are not subscribed already, consider subscribing to the channel. I post Dauntless content here every week. So the placement of each item on the list is going to take into account the weapon's performance in both casual play as well as heroic escalation and trials play. And weapons get ranked with one another based on several factors, including the weapon unique effect, the cell slots, and the built-in perks. And if there's a difference between how a unique effect works for one weapon class over another weapon class, I will be sure to mention that and give the appropriate rating for that. The only weapons that won't be featured on this list will be repeaters, as the repeater refresh is still a solid 3 weeks away right now, and currently there wouldn't be much of a point in including how they function at the moment. But I have included the twin suns, as it's likely they aren't going to change much in the repeater refresh. But when the repeater refresh comes out, perhaps I could do a separate tier list video like this for repeaters. But with that stuff out of the way, let's get into it. And we're going to start off with the non-legendary weapons. And we'll begin with the Boreous Weapons. The Boreous Weapons are thankfully all pretty much the same, being that they have conditioning as their built-in perk, and their cell slots are the same for all 6 of the weapon types here, being power and defense slots. And the unique effects are all rather similar, having to deal with generating frost sprites that will deal extra damage and frost damage on the next weapon hit. However, the way that you create the frost sprites is different for each weapon. I would say the weapons that have it the worst in this regard are the hammer and strikers. For strikers, you need to use the surge ability, and surging isn't something you really want to do. And for hammer, spending ammo is something you do a lot of at the end of combos with an Aether Slam. However, the sprites then get applied to the weakest attack you have. In the middle of the benefit, we have War Pike and Axe, both of which have an easy method to getting the sprites, but the sprites themselves don't really spam themselves. And on top, we would have the Sword and the Chain Blades, which are adept at spamming the frost sprites and only get better when it comes to the fight going on longer, such as in trials and heroic escalation. The Boreous Weapons have incurred some pretty major flaws recently though. Conditioning was decent for a mobility cell, but not now that adrenaline has proven to be particularly useful and sometimes meta. When it comes to the power slots, they are rather underwhelming right now, as having almost all technique slots is currently amazing in the meta. And defensive slots can be alright in casual play for some tough and parasitic, but when it comes to trials, they are unwanted. With all that being said, here is my first ranking. The Chain Blades and Sword get an A because of how strong and particularly spammable the unique effect is. Both of these weapons have the case to be made for them being the strongest of the Frost Chain Blades and the Frost Swords. The Axe and War Pike get a B, not bad but not particularly standing out in the endgame. And the Hammer and Strikers get a C. Moving on to the Karabakh Weapons now. Each of the Karabakh weapons has Aether Hunter as the built-in perk, and that is a harsh negative for them. All of them also have a defensive slot on them. The Sword, Axe, and Hammer have a power slot as the second slot, while the Strikers, Chain Blades, and War Pike have a technique slot. The Karabakh unique effect will shoot a fiery cone from the player once a certain amount of stamina has been spent. For Sword, Hammer, and Pike, you need to spend 125 stamina. For Chain Blades, it's 150, and for Strikers and Axe, it's 100 stamina. The Axe is going to get a B from me, as it spends stamina quickly and has low stamina requirement. I'm going to throw the Strikers, Sword, War Pike, and Chain Blades all in the C tier. But I'm going to throw the Hammer in the D tier because it can be kind of difficult to spend stamina on the Hammer. The Charog axe is considerable for being the best of the blaze axes, but I wouldn't say that it's still a really desirable weapon overall. When it comes to casual and non-casual play, you're likely leaving behind the Charog weapons unless it's the very beginning of the game and you need the extra power rating over another blaze weapon. Next up, we have the Drastic Weapons, and there are now actually two versions of the Drastic Weapons, the regular version and the Thunderdeep Drastic version, and I'm going to lump these assessments together. The regular version has Etheric Attunement as the built-in perk, and the Thunderdeep version has Etheric Evasion as the built-in perk. The regular Drastic Sword has a power and a utility slot, the regular Drastic Hammer and Axe have a power and a defense slot, and the regular Drastic Chain Blades, Pike, and Strikers have a power and a technique slot. The Thunderdeep Drastic Weapons all have a power and a technique slot, which makes them better for Hammer, Axe, and Swords in the perk economy. And the Thunderdeep Weapons and the regular Drastic Weapons have the same unique effects based on their weapon class. The Sword, Pike, and Chain Blades deal bonus damage against tails, and the Axe, Hammer, and Strikers deal bonus damage against heads. The bonus damage against heads weapons are rather decent, as doing bonus damage against the head also helps in dealing extra stagger damage, which can go a little bit of way into keeping the behemoth stunned. However, the bonus damage against tails isn't particularly good, especially since behemoths tend to try to move you away from their tails. With that being said, I'm going to give the Strikers, Hammer, Axe, and Chain Blades the B tier. Defense slots aren't entirely bad for casual play, and the extra damage from the unique effect can make up for what perk you may have chosen, so the Hammer and Axe are okay here. And though the Strikers and also the Thunderdeep Weapons have better cell slots here, I wouldn't go as far as putting them in the A tier. The War Pike is going to get the C tier, and the regular Drastic Sword is going to get the D tier from me. I don't really like the utility slot on it, and I would kind of rate them under defense slots for casual play at least, but when it comes to the Thunderdeep Drastic Sword, I would let it stay in the C tier. Moving on to the Embermane weapons, they all come with Evasive Fury as the built-in perk as well as a mobility slot. The Sword, Chain Blades, Pike, and Strikers come with a technique slot, and the Axe and Hammer come with a power slot. The Embermane weapons will add a certain amount of part damage, stagger damage, or wound damage after a certain amount of hits. The Axe, Chain Blades, and Sword give part damage, the Hammer and Strikers give stagger damage, and the Warpike gives wound damage. Unfortunately, we typically want our weapon unique effect to deal extra core damage, which would help the weapon in dealing all of these damage types that it deals. And the Embermane weapons also have the cardinal sin of Dauntless weaponry, and that's having a mobility slot, although that's not as bad anymore because of Adrenaline being rather helpful, which gives meaning to the mobility cell Endurance. But even still, I'm going to condemn them to the D tier, except for the Chain Blades, which I will give a bump to the C. The Chain Blades get a pass because even some more experienced players may use them when they want to farm a new behemoth's parts. But we'll take a look at the exotic weapons now. The Molten Edict has Berserker built in, and a power slot as well as one prismatic slot, meaning any type of cell can go into it. Molten Edict has special twists to the Hammer abilities and has a slightly stronger version of the Hammer Aether Slam. I would have given it the A tier, but seeing as it's dominating the Quillshot trials right now, even after getting nerfed, I'll sneak it into the S tier. For the God Hand, we have Savagery built in with a power and the prismatic slot. The God Hand beam attack is its special ability, and it does find itself slightly more favorable in terms of the Radiant War Pikes. However, my main gripe with it is the power slot, because this is a War Pike. It really should have had a technique slot, because even before this technique slot meta, the War Pikes loved technique slots. So I'll go ahead and give it a B tier. The Hunger Sword has Rage Hunter with a power slot and prismatic slot, and its special ability is Valiant Overdrive with invincibility frames, but also with lifesteal and increased damage. But it will also have you take damage over time. Rage Hunter isn't particularly strong at the moment, and the power slot isn't too nice either. I'm gonna give the Hunger a C tier. It's like fine, but there are other better weapon choices. And now for the Twin Suns, which have Evasive Fury, a Technique slot, and a Prismatic slot. They play around having extra crit chance and mag bombs being their main source of damage. The main issue with the Twin Suns is that their shots deal less base damage than the regular repeaters, and regular repeaters, through the use of the Captain's Grip, can be helpful for attack speed when playing in a squad. So I'm going to give the Twin Suns a C because Discipline kind of bumps them up a bit more to be more useful. But next up we have the Nasher Weapons. The Nasher Weapons will periodically cause the player to enrage, and during this rage they will deal 15% more damage and become unstaggerable. All of them have Rage Hunter as the built-in perk. Strikers, Chainblades, and Pike have a technique and a utility slot, the axe and the hammer have a power and utility slot, and the sword has a utility and a defense slot. 15% damage some of the time from a weapon unique effect isn't particularly good. Even if it were 15% damage all of the time, they still wouldn't be particularly good. That being said, they are the best neutral weapons, but that doesn't say much. You're not really going to use a neutral weapon aside from when you need a neutral weapon for a bounty or to do damage mastery or for a weekly challenge. And once again, Rage Hunter isn't particularly good either, but Nasher Weapons are supposed to be a bit of a starter weapon type and aren't supposed to be really good in the endgame. After a bit of internal struggle, I've decided to put them all at a flat D tier. Moving on to the Hellion Weapons. All of the Hellion Weapons have 2 power slots and Overpower as the built-in perk. This would be pretty negative now, but Overpower is the best power cell, and the Hellion Weapons have an amazing unique effect depending on the weapon. After a number of hits, your next hit will deal 225 bonus damage, and this is core damage, meaning it damaged the behemoth's health bar. This works the best for the chain blades, which I will put in the A tier, as it activates once per each swinging blades combo, giving it about 5 unique effect procs every 10 seconds or so. Then strikers and pike would have the next most solid benefits, followed by hammer and sword. I'll give all of these weapons the B tier. The pike has had so many changes to how useful the flurry attack is that I wouldn't feel right putting it at A tier anymore, at least while the flurry attack is not as good as the harvesting attacks. And then the Hellion Axe gets demoted to the C tier. You need 5 hits to activate it, and the main combo used on Axe is only 4 hits long, meaning it activates less than once per combo, and the combos are very long when you are charging your attacks. I would also put the sword in the C tier, however, when using the Ardent Cyclone special, the ability activates much more frequently and balances it out. Next up are the Karabakh Weapons, and all of the Karabakh Weapons have a unique effect that spins whirling blades around the player, which deal damage and explode after a while. The sword, warpike, strikers, and chain blades have Bladestorm as the built-in perk, and technique and mobility slots. The axe and hammer have power and technique slots, which would be amazing but is overshadowed by having deconstruction as the built-in perk. So the built-in perks on these weapons aren't great, but the unique effect is easily the best when it comes to the sustained DPS of Terra weapons. After some thinking, I decided to give all of these weapons the B tier. And you could argue due to Adrenaline, the mobility slot isn't exactly a weakness anymore, and their unique effects would put them in the A tier if not for their built-in perks. Next up is another Terra weapon, the Koshai Weapons. All of the Koshai weapons have Sharpened as the built-in perk and a power and a utility slot. The Koshai weapon unique effect is, lightly put, rather bad. It does actually increase damage, but it's only for a few hits, and that makes it such a small degree in the scope of sustained DPS that it might as well not increase damage at all. The Koshai weapon's only claim to fame is that shock escalation one-shot builds exist because you only need 1 hit to kill the behemoth, then you have a 50% damage unique effect, which is rather strong. But if you have to do more than the number of hits that you have the damage bonus for, then it's not very good. You have to stop fighting the behemoth to get your damage bonus, and that's just not great at all. Combine that with not so good cell slots and built-in perks, and these weapons are bringing up the rears. I'm giving out the first Fs of this tier list to the Koshai Strikers, Hammer, and Sword. And the Pike, Axe, and Chain Blades get moved up to a C because they each have a high base damage special that would be the most likely candidate to get you a one-shot and therefore actually have a case to be used. Next we have the Naysag Weapons, and they have one of the more interesting mixes of weapon unique effects. The sword has barbed built in, with a utility and a mobility slot, and when you break a part you heal for 200. Its perk increases wound damage, but its unique effect deals with part damage. No synergy there, and it's got bad cell slots in my opinion, and there are much better healing options, so it's getting an F. The Axe has Savagery, a power and utility slot, and when you land perfectly charged attacks, you heal for 100. Savagery is a much better perk to have, but you need to have some type of wound damage source to make use of it. Even if its situation is slightly better than the sword, I'm still giving it an F. For the Naysag Hammer, it has Savagery, power, and utility slots, and heals for 300 when a behemoth is staggered. Once again, Savagery but no way to wound, and there's a cell that has this exact unique effect, so I'm going to give it an F. The Chain Blades have Barbed, a technique and utility slot, and heal for 200 when a part is broken. Same situation as the sword, but I would say the technique slot makes it slightly more bearable, so I'll give it a D. The Naysag Strikers also get a D, having Savagery, a technique slot and a utility slot, and the same stagger effect as the hammer. But the Naysag Warpike squeaks ahead of all of the other weapons here. It has barbed built in, technique and utility slots, and you get 5% lifesteal against wounded parts. The lifesteal part is great, and Warpikes can actually wound, so they get to take advantage of this sort of thing. And the cell slots aren't terrible, I'll give it a C tier, and you'd likely use this for more casual stuff, and a Drastic Pike for more serious stuff. And now it's time for the Pangar Weapons. Pangar Weapons all have the same unique effect, a giant frostball that explodes for 3000 base damage or 4500 base damage when you or a teammate blows it up. It also deals stagger damage on all weapons but Warpike, which deals wound damage. The Sword, Hammer, Axe, and Strikers have Knockout King as the built-in perk, and the Chain Blades and Pike have weighted strikes. And the Sword, Hammer, and Axe have power and defense slots, while the Strikers, Chain Blades, and Pike have technique and defense slots. Nobody can really argue the Pangar balls are amazing, the only downside being that they have a 90-second cooldown after the explosion. And the only kind of gripe you can have about the weapons are the perks and the cell slots, but because the unique effect is so powerful, I've got to put them in the A tier. Next up, Quillshot Weapons. Don't use them. Quillshot Weapons do not have a unique effect, at least at the time of this video. All of them have Acidic as the built-in perk, which isn't awful since the wound rework, but you're still not trying to use it. Sword, Chain Blades, Strikers, and Pike have a technique and defense slot, while the Axe and Hammer have a power and defense slot. But they really just do nothing in terms of the Dauntless weaponry scene, so they all get an F. Rezakiri weapon time. Each of the Rezakiri weapons has the unique effect of having a 10% chance for attacks to hit twice. There are exceptions to what can and cannot double hit though. All of the weapons have Cunning as the built-in perk, which is good for the Discipline Omnicell. The Strikers, Pike, and Chain Blades have a power and a technique slot, the Sword has a technique and a utility slot, and the Axe and Hammer have a power and a mobility slot. If it weren't for Adrenaline being useful now, the Axe and Hammer would be rated lower than the other weapons of this category, but I guess they're fine now. And this is a really hard one to place, but I'm going to go with a C tier, but they're on the brink of being a B tier. Like, the unique effect isn't quite as good as the other unique effects above it, but it can get a rather fantastic perk summary on some of the weapons. Now we've got the Riftstalker weapons, and these are just great, one of the better unique effects in the game. Dealing damage summons shadow orbs that give 2.25% damage each and 4.5% damage each at more than 5 with a maximum of 8 orbs. This means a max damage increase of 36%, which you can reasonably sustain after the opening seconds of a fight. All of the weapons have a technique and a utility slot, and the Assassin's Frenzy perk built in. Assassin's Frenzy isn't bad, but it's not completely amazing, it's just kind of there. With that being said, the weapons that have frequent high base damage moves are the ones that benefit from this unique effect the most. We'll give an A tier to the axe, hammer, strikers, and sword. Chain blades will get a B tier, but mostly because the base damage of the attacks is often under 100. And the war pike will get a B tier as well. The flurry attack has low base damage, but it seems you could make the case for an A tier if you use the old spin to win strategy. Now we've got strike weapons, and they're also sort of in the category of don't use them. All of them have conditioning built in, and the unique effect is after dodging, your next attack will deal extra damage and part damage. You don't really want to dodge a lot because that's not dealing damage. And all of these weapons have one mobility slot, but the sword actually has two. The hammer and axe have a power slot as a second slot and technique slot for chain blades, pike, and strikers. I'm going to give them all an F. You could argue for a D, but I'm going to stick them with an F. Even if you wanted to play the adrenaline and endurance strat, they still have conditioning, so that makes the mobility slots pretty useless. Onto the Shroud Weapons, and the relevance of these has gone down quite a bit because of Omnicells. When you're under 20% HP, you'll gain 50% damage, and this is really strong, but this means you'll likely have to take 2 or 3 hits of damage now rather than just 1, which makes it minimally useful in competitive play now. But these would be great for a living on the edge casual play strategy. All of them have cunning built in, and the sword, axe, and hammer have power and utility slots, and the strikers, chain blades, and pike have technique and utility slots. I'm going to give the Shroud Weapons a somewhat generous C here. They have an amazing unique effect if you can make it work, but it's really difficult to make it work practically. They have okay-ish perk summary as well, but with their previous main use being for mostly competitive reasons, I would have to say they are a C. But when you do have the unique effect working properly, this is an A tier, maybe even a standalone S tier. Next we've got the Scarn Weapons, and the Scarn Weapons got so hilariously nerfed by the Omnicell update. The Bastion Omnicell stole its unique effect, but made it worse, and the new unique effect is also worse too. After using your lantern hold, you gain shield that will expire after 25 seconds, meaning you need some type of lantern cooldown reduction to be able to stack it. The axe, hammer, and sword have power and defense slots, while the pike, strikers, and chain blades have technique and defense slots. And the axe, hammer, sword, and strikers have knockout king, while the pike and chain blades have weighted strikes. So not particularly good on the perks and slots, but that being said, they still can be used for some extra survivability, particularly for heroic escalation and a gimmick damage trick with galvanized. I'll put them in the C tier, but like a low C tier. Time now for the Skrave Weapons. They all have the same unique effect. A dodge once every 30 seconds will give you 3 ice mines that deal 300 damage each. Hammer and axe with a power and mobility slot, the sword, pike, strikers, and chain blades have a technique and mobility. And the built-in perk is Nimble, which I might argue as the worst built-in perk on any weapon. I wouldn't say the unique effect is necessarily horrible, but if you're waiting for damage on a cooldown anyway, you might as well be using the Pangar Weapons better and the same element. I'll give them a D tier because the Boreous Weapons are also better no matter which Boreous weapon you choose. It's Stormcloth Weapon time, and there are a variety of weapon abilities here. The strikers have etheric attunement, technique, and a mobility slot, and when dodging through an attack you extend the duration of your mantra timer. This doesn't necessarily translate to any real damage, and the built-in perk isn't amazing, and you've got the mobility slot to think of as well, so I'm going to throw them in the D tier as there's not much of a reason to use them. The Warpike has Energized, and after dodging through an attack, your attacks will gain 100% meter for 4 seconds, and it has a mobility and a technique slot. There's some super specific niche case where this could be useful in some trial squad, but nothing really realistic. And you'd probably just use the dodge through to proc Etheric Evasion for more lantern damage when you have the Thunder Deep Pike anyway, so I'll give this one a D tier as well. The chain blades are the same as the war pike, but they only get the meter for 3 seconds. For war pike and chain blades, you don't really need energized at all. Weapon meter isn't incredibly difficult to get on these, so I'll stick the chain blades at a D tier as well. For the hammer, it has etheric attunement built in, a power and mobility slot, and dodging through an attack reloads 3 aether charged ammo. Not going to lie, that's actually not too bad of a unique effect, but hammers, particularly in casual play, like to play the stagger locking game, and only really spend their ammo on aether slams. So I would give this like a high D or a low C. I'll just put it in C. The axe has energized, power and mobility slots, and dodging through an attack gives you bonus meter for 5 seconds. The only real struggle to get meter on the axe, I would say, is at the very beginning of a fight, and once you've thrown your axe, you'll likely reach max meter before the cooldown ends anyway on the next throw, so this is still going to get a D tier. And the Stormcloth Sword is basically the only claim to fame of the Stormcloth Weapons. It has energized, a technique and a mobility slot, and has the dodge through meter effect for 4 seconds. Meter generation is only really relevant on the sword because these days when you're in the overdrive specials you still build weapon meter. And this is particularly good for shock swords, as overdrive specials are the best way to get an elemental proc, and shock elemental procs stun the behemoth, which can lead to stagger locking more easily. Stormcloth Sword is going to get a B, arguably the best of the shock weapons, but is most definitely the best shock sword. And this brings us to our final non-legendary weapon, Valomir Weapons. Valomir Weapons are more relevant now that we have usually a minimum of 800 HP. The Valomir weapon unique effect charges based on your current health, and once charged, your next attack will deal 700 damage. All of the weapons come with Aether Hunter as well as power and utility slots. The unique effect is pretty good, particularly when it comes to running tough and by extension tenacious in your build, as well as the Iceborne Omnicell. At 1700 HP, this unique effect charges rather quickly. The drawback is how Berserker can conflict with a unique effect in a major way, and Berserker is one of the more useful damage increasing cells these days. Additionally, Aether Hunter is pretty bad. Most behemoths outside of Heroic Escalation and Trials won't ever Aether Charge, so this is basically a dead perk. Overall, I'd give the Valomir weapons a C, but when used in a tough Iceborne build, I would bump them up to a B. And this means we can finally talk about the legendary weapons. The legendary weapons are able to inherit the built-in perk and the unique effect of a weapon. They also have the benefit of 2 prismatic slots, which again can hold any cell. This means they are only really bound by how good their bonding weapons are for the element. And many of the perk economy reasons that the base weapons get put on a lower tier on the list, the legendary weapons can ignore that. They also gain a legendary ability which can be rather useful. So you can sort of consider the legendary weapons as being 1 tier above their best base weapon of that type. Well, what does this mean then? Well, starting with the Boreous Weapons, I'll put them 1 tier above their Karabakh Weapons, being the best of the terror weapons, meaning they will take the A tier. For the Karabakh Weapons, I'd be okay with putting them in the A tier, due to the many utility uses of the legendary ability, as well as having the other positive perks of the Radiant and legendary weapons. The Malkarian Weapons take the shock weapons to the A tier, aside from the Warpike, which would be in the B tier. The Thrax weapons will take the first places in the S tier since the Molten Edict, for the sword, strikers, hammer, and axe. But the chain blades and the Warpike will stay in the A tier. The Torgadoro chain blades will take a place in the S tier as well, with all of the other Torgadoro weapons being in the A tier. It is important to note that you can't bond exotic weapons, therefore the Torg hammer is not in the S tier. And finally, Urska weapons, all of which I would designate in the S tier due to the Pangar bonds. However, last and certainly not least, we have the recruit weapons. Alright, I'm just kidding. They're all going to get an F tier. Probably an F- tier because they don't have built-in perks, can't be power surged, and have no cell slots. But they are all clean and rather good when it comes to fashion. And that's really all that matters in Dauntless anyway, right? But here it is. This is my Dauntless all weapons tier list, aside from repeaters. Let me know what you guys think. There are some weapons where you could argue they move up or down one tier, but I think this is pretty fair for most of them. But if you enjoyed and made it to the end of the video, consider dropping a like and subscribing for more Dauntless content. But I have been Trevor, I go by the Mr. Trails, and I will catch you guys next time.